everyone, and welcome to the Curious Geographer this afternoon YouTube channel and Time for Geography as well. I am super excited that today we are joined by Professor Mark Mulligan, who is a Professor of Physical and Environmental Geography at King's College London. So Mark is just currently on the screen. And in this interview, which is in collaboration with Time for Geography and in partnership with King's College London, we are going to explore the threats facing tropical rainforests, from commercial agriculture to logging and mining, and also investigate some of the solutions. So we're going to dive straight in. I'm going to pass over to Mark, Mark, would you mind can you start by telling us kind of why are rainforests important and what do rainforests do for us?
Well, rainforests, irrespective of what they do for us, possess intrinsic value. They are important because they exist and because the species within them exist, and it's not for us as one species to determine the future of other species. And if you look at the image behind me, you'll see there are really two values that we give to nature in general and to rainforests specifically. One is this biocentric argument that I just mentioned, that species have their own value. The other is what we call an anthropocentric argument, and that means species have value to people. And that value that they have for us is that they provide us with what we call ecosystem services. These are nature's contributions to people. And we classify those services in three different areas. One is provisioning services, so where nature provides to us, and nature, rainforests provide timber, fuel wood, grazing land, fish catches, non-wood forest products. They support the provision of clean water, and they provide services such as pollination and pest control. So they are provisioning. There are regulating services that rainforests also provide to us. And the provisioning services, including water, you can see in the image of on the slide there of the rainfall in the tropics and just how much more water there is. For example, in London, the smallest bar graph there, and in a rainforest, the largest one. Also in the next image, where you see an outline of a series of maps, 9 maps. This is the Amazon basin, one of the largest rainforest on Earth. And what we see here is a daily cycle of rainfall, which indicates the mechanism by which rainforests help generate rainfall. Basically, in the morning in rainforests, the top line there, the middle line there, doesn't rain very much. It's rained the night before. The rain is all evaporating from the canopy, and then suddenly these big convective cumulonimbus clouds are produced, and bang, 9 o'clock in the afternoon, it always rains. In the evening, it always rains very hard across the entire basin. So 20% of the rainfall in the Amazon is recycled. Those are provisioning services. Regulating services are the services provided to help regulate our environment by rainforests. These include, for example, the sequestration, the taking in of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into vegetation. You can see that again on the image behind me. The red areas and the yellow areas are the areas of the planet that take in most carbon dioxide and store it in timber, in soil, and on leaves. So those regulating services are important, and that includes, as well as regulating the climate, regulating natural hazards. And then finally, rainforests provide us with what we call cultural services. So nature-based tourism and the sheer value spiritually and for your mental health of being in an environment that has nature. So nature provides a lot, and of course, beyond those services, nature also and rainforests in particular provide vast reserves of biodiversity, which is itself a contribution to people. Plants and animals have evolved to solve many of the problems that we also need to solve. And around, for example, 25% of prescription drugs are made from plants, and they're made from rainforest plants. And of the 3,000 plants with anti-cancer properties that we know about so far, and there may be many more out there, 70% are from rainforests. So there are real practical values to biodiversity, and most biodiversity, as you'll see later, is from rainforests. But also we get most of our good ideas as humans from nature. And there are some obvious examples of that. You know, Velcro was invented in the 1940s because its inventor was removing the burrs of a plant from his dog's fur. He looked at those burrs under a microscope and thought, I can do this. And that's where Velcro comes from.
So much that you've just talked about, and I think it just really kind of sets up the fact that we're going to. I've got a bit of echo coming in. I don't know, Mark, if that's from your side. I'm not sure. Okay. Really sets up in terms of particularly what you've just said about the value, and 25% of prescription drugs are made by plants from rainforest plants. Particularly the significance what we're going to talk about next in terms of deforestation. But let's talk about that diversity that you mentioned before. Why are there so many species in a tropical rainforest? We hear that, there's loads of diversity in terms of plants and animals as well. So why are rainforests so diverse?
Well, species diversity is a really interesting thing. It's highly uncertain. We know that we have described around 2 million species on Earth. But that there could be between 3 and 30 million species. It's most likely there's about 9 million, but we really don't know. The important thing is that 2/3 of the species that we've described so far are from tropical rainforests, even though they cover only 7% of the Earth's surface. So tropical rainforests really do host a huge number of species. And just 1 hectare, which is 100 meters by 100 meters of rainforest, can have 400 species of tree. Whereas a hectare of forest in the United States or in Europe would have fewer than 20. The whole of Europe has 570 species of butterflies, whilst a single national park in Peru, Manu, has 1,300 species. So that goes to show just how, intense the amount of biodiversity in rainforests is. And there are 2 reasons for that. Not just the high biodiversity, but the high abundance of life in rainforests is because rainforests have a high potential to generate diversity and a high potential to maintain diversity. And the generation of diversity comes about because organisms in the tropics have a longer time, or have had a longer time in which to evolve new species, because these climates have been stable for a very long time. Whereas in temperate zones, species have been periodically wiped out by glaciations during the ice ages. And in the tropics, evolution proceeds faster than it does in other climates. So more species have been generated in rainforests because of that stability over long periods of time. But just as importantly, more species in rainforests can be maintained because the resources that we have in a rainforest are high, and non-seasonal sunlight, temperature, and water, for example, means that you have a lot of energy in the system, you have high productivity, and high productivity means high plant biomass. And where you have a high plant biomass, you have a significant vertical structure or layering of the forest, so that in rainforests you can sometimes have 11 layers of leaves above the ground. So 11 meters squared of leaf per meter squared of ground. And this is a lot of space compared to, for example, a grassland where you just have the ground. And so the reliable environmental conditions of rainforest climates means that plants and animals can become very specialist. They can be specialist in what they eat, in where in the rainforest they inhabit, and in what time of day they are active. Whereas in more seasonal and variable conditions like we have in the UK, for example, species have to become generalists to survive. They have to eat this when it's available and that when it's available and so on. And so in seasonal and variable environments, these sort of generalist species actually overlap with other species, and they're in competition with each other, therefore, because they occupy the same space or they're after the same food or whatever, whereas specialists overlap much less, so they can coexist in the same system. And so you can maintain many species in a rainforest, which you can't do outside of a rainforest. Once they're generated, therefore, they last a very long time. There's still a huge amount we don't know about rainforest biodiversity, especially in rainforest canopies. And if you look at the image that's coming up now, you'll see that, in my view, a tropical forest canopy is virtually unexplored. We know more actually about the Moon and Mars than we do about the canopies of rainforest, because they're really very difficult to access. Most research in rainforest is at ground level. Very few people actually climb rainforest trees and examine biodiversity up there. And there's a few trillion of these trees to climb, and most species that are yet to be found probably live up there.
Can I say thank you? That was a really clear explanation, because often we talk about kind of why are rainforests so biodiverse, and I mean at GCSE students pretty much say because there's a good climate for plants and animals to live in. But I think that was really interesting in terms of particularly thinking about the impact of glaciation and variable climates at different time periods, and also about animals becoming specialists as well and not generalists. So I think that was a really, really interesting explanation of why there are so many kind of different species and it's so biodiverse. And I'm quite surprised that we know more about the Moon and Mars. Is that just because humans haven't accessed all areas, or it's just there's just so much to research?
Well, the Moon and Mars are much simpler, so that's on our side. And we have satellites looking at the Moon and Mars. We have rovers. We have all of this going on. Whereas in rainforest canopies, yeah, we've climbed a few, but that's probably in the hundreds. And done serious, biodiversity research in a few hundred trees probably, whereas there are trillions there. And the important thing about that is that, many rainforest species are what we call host specific. That means that you get a different suite of species on each species of tree. And if there are, hundreds of species of tree in a hectare of rainforest, and each of those species of tree has 100 different species of arthropod, insect or other invertebrates on them, then that multiplies very quickly. And we've explored a few protected areas where there are sort of rainforest research stations and so on, but most of these large rainforests have just not been explored in the way that other ecosystems have.
Okay, should we kind of talk about one of the key parts of the interview, which is really what are the key threats to rainforests? And then kind of after that, maybe we can kind of pause briefly in between, but how are we addressing them?
Sure. And let's consider what we mean by threats. These threats are threats to nature, because if rainforests are impacted, then biodiversity is impacted. But given what we said earlier, threats to nature are also threats to us, because nature provides us with all these ecosystem services that make our lives much easier by providing us with food and water, by regulating our climate, environment, etc. And I think the audience will know the key global threats to biodiversity. They are given this acronym HIPPO. Habitat alteration is the first one, so that's the H, such as deforestation. Invasive species is the I. Pollution of water, air, and soil is the first P. Population growth is really a cause of the other threats, is the second P. And overexploitation, for example, of harvested wild species like fish, or indeed of trees, or whatever it is. So HIPPO are the key global threats to biodiversity. The key threats to rainforests are a subset of those, which you can see on the slide here, and they are logging of rainforests for timber and paper, deforestation for subsistence or commercial agriculture. So what that means is, often in rainforests, the key driver for a threat to rainforests is that a road is built, and therefore the rainforests are accessible. And once a rainforest is accessible, usually, the first process is something extractive, like logging or mining or oil and gas exploration and exploitation. And that is really what often drives the road building. But of course, once that is done, or alongside that, that increased accessibility, also for agricultural purposes. And there are two types of agriculture. There's subsistence agriculture. So this is individuals, often the poorest, who are eking out a living by growing food so that they can live. That's subsistence. They're not necessarily bringing food to market. And then there's the much larger scale industrial commercial agriculture, which is usually providing materials for global commodities that are traded around the world, and we are the main driver of that as consumers of these commodities, whether it be grazing land that is providing milk or meat, or whether it's cropland that is providing oil palm for palm oil, or soya, or for cattle feedstock, or whatever it is. So, logging for timber and paper, deforestation for agriculture and its associated use of fire, mining for metals and minerals, and oil and gas exploitation are very important as threats, but climate change is increasingly an important threat. Rainforests, although they didn't disappear during the glaciations, they did contract significantly because rainforest areas got much drier during the glaciations. And the risk is under climate change that the same will happen. The rainforest zones will become much drier and that they will turn into savannas. And of course, that would be a big impact both on the biodiversity and the ecosystem services that they provide. There are also many large dams going into rainforests. They are positive in a way because they're trying to address the production of more renewable energy. Mostly they're hydropower dams, but at the same time they have impacts particularly on aquatic rainforest species, so those that live in the rivers. And so most of these threats are really transnational corporations doing this on our behalf. And then there are also threats from smallholder agriculturalists and indigenous populations, but they have a small impact globally. The key driver, as I said, is roads, because accessibility to an area always leads to threat and then pressure. And we can see a couple of examples here. Let's look at this, the slide, and you will see a map that we produced in one of our research products called Costing Nature. And this is a map of current human pressure in the Amazon. And the transparent areas have no pressure, or very, very low pressure. And then the colors that you see going from blue to red, the further you go into the green, yellow, red direction, the greater the pressure. And you can see that these pressures include a variety of things, including population, wildfire, grazing, agriculture, etc., etc. And mostly in the Amazon, they're concentrated in the south and the east. That's called the arc of deforestation, and has been deforesting, for decades and decades. There are also significant pressures alongside the foothills of the Andes, so the Andean countries and their parts of the Amazon. But on the positive side, large parts of the Amazon are relatively free from deforestation and relatively free from threats at the moment. It is, after all, the most intact rainforest we have. The situation is much worse in the African rainforest and in the Southeast Asian rainforest. However, if we look at the next image is about future threat rather than current pressure on the Amazon. And you can see there are no transparent areas. threats now. The whole of the Amazon has color. And these threats include, that from accessibility, so where new roads are likely to go in, proximity to recent deforestation, change in population, and climate change. And the fact that we have colors all over the Amazon reflects the fact that climate change threatens the entire Amazon in terms of the potential drying out of the ecosystem and conversion to savanna. Not all of it to the same extent, but certainly most of it affected in some way. And then we have some areas close to current pressured areas where we expect that pressure to go further out because there are new oil and gas developments or new mining developments that we know about into the future. So those two slides, I think, show clearly what some of the pressures and the threats are, and indeed most tropical forests, except the Amazon and to a certain extent the central Congo, are now small islands of forest in protected areas surrounded by agriculture. The Amazon and the heart of the Congo are unique in having such large areas currently with very low pressure.
Can we just, before we go on to talking about solutions, talk about, I think the echo's coming through again. I don't know if that's from your side.
I don't know. It's normally fine, although I don't normally use Skype.
Okay. That's fine. I can hear. I think maybe it was just the beginning of me speaking, so we're all back again. In terms of the maps that you just shown us, which look amazing to see the stark contrast between the current and future. How did you actually quantify that all of it was potentially going to be affected? How did you manage to work that out?
Okay, so what we do with costing nature and the threats layer in that tool is for climate change, we take the average of the temperature and precipitation change in each square kilometer from 17 different climate models, right? So there are around 20 climate models that project what the future might look like. And we look at the difference between temperature and precipitation now and then in projected in 2050 on average by these 17 different models in order to give us a projected change in temperature and precipitation for each square kilometer. And so that's the layer that defines that we will have some change everywhere in the Amazon. I mean, this is the thing with climate change. You can define a protected area like a national park and protect against land use change, but that doesn't keep climate change out. Because that's that occurs everywhere and there's no way to keep it out. And so the best way, of course, to avoid climate change impacting the Amazon is to do your best, to mitigate that climate change in the first place, which of course the Amazon is partly doing. It's on our side, but if climate change impacts the Amazon and it starts to turn to savanna, then much of the carbon stock and some of the carbon sequestration that currently helps mitigate climate change may no longer do so. And so, what we're concerned about, what scientists are concerned about, is this sort of runaway effect that, climate change affects existing stocks and fluxes of carbon dioxide and makes them worse in what we call a sort of positive feedback cycle. However, as you see, these things are longer term than land use change. The immediate threat to the Amazon, as has already happened in most of the other rainforests, is land use change. That is much more avoidable and much more solvable.
Yeah, brilliant. So that map, because I think what's interesting is that students often learn that obviously deforestation can lead to increased rates of climate change, but they don't necessarily think of the actual impact of climate change back on the Amazon rainforest. So I think that's why the map is so interesting that you've shown, is that it's all those kind of land use changes that you've spoken about, but also climate change being that added effect, as you've just clearly explained.
Yeah, it's certainly, the two are important and you can never separate, particularly when it comes to tropical forests, land use and climate change, because land use affects climate directly, but it also affects climate through carbon budgets. and therefore, and in turn, climate affects land use. It's a cycle which is impossible to, to break.
And then just kind of to go back on kind of two questions. I thought that at one point the Amazon was also a source of carbon dioxide and not just intaking it because of the deforestation that occurs.
Well, there's lots of work on this, and some papers say it's recently become a source rather than a sink. Others are not so sure. If you look at the area that's currently under pressure in the Amazon, you can see that it's about a third of the Amazon, and the rest uh, is relatively unaffected. Now, there has been some climate drying and a number of big droughts in the Amazon in the last few years. And those droughts have, along with the fires that have got worse because of the droughts and the agricultural expansion, they will have put quite a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I think there is some logic for saying that under certain conditions, the Amazon can be, a flip over to being a source of greenhouse gases. But I think in the long term, it's not so far. Um, and the risk is that if the drying continues, then we might have some years where it is and some years where it isn't, and eventually maybe most years where it is a source. And then, of course, it all becomes self-reinforcing.
And then would it be possible just to explain to students a bit more about how commercial farming causes deforestation, and kind of how maybe people who are farming actually cut down the trees to make space? Are you able, to explain why really does commercial farming cause deforestation?
Yeah, I think the techniques vary place to place, but in various places in 1 year.
Sorry,
And so
Mark.
the rates of,
I
okay, so in Paraguay, for example, individual fields of 10 by 10 kilometers can be produced in a single burning season, right? And that can be repeated many times wherever a farmer is expanding. And so it's the scale and the rate of commercial farming that is much higher. Whereas, an individual with an axe who's extending their plot in a sort of shifting cultivation, well, on the one hand, they will only cut a few trees a year, and of course that can be multiplied by many people, but they only cut a few trees a year. And they will work much more in harmony with the forest in a sort of polycultural system, growing many different forest species on which to survive. And they, after a few years, because they're not using fertilizer, their soil will no longer produce, and so they will abandon that area. That's the shifting, and they will cut another piece, and that area will recover. Rainforests, if you leave them alone, will recover in short order, whereas commercial farming basically is propped up by pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. And so, once rainforest is cut, then it never comes back.
I think it's quite shocking when students see the images of it just completely bare, the rainforest ground. Is it purely just for space? Is that the reason the Amazon, say, is used for, say, commercial cattle farming?
It's because it's cheap land. I mean, we are running out of agricultural land. Most of the expansion that's possible outside of rainforest areas has already happened. And, agriculture is the largest ecosystem on the planet by far. Um, And really, the areas in which further expansion can occur now are the wilderness areas like tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests are not great for agriculture. It's not a great climate for agriculture, although it's productive for vegetation. Rainforest soils are very poor. You know, the reason that rainforests have this sort of exuberant vegetation on a very poor soil is that rainforest trees have mechanisms to recycle nutrients that are very, very efficient. Whereas, you know, plants that we grow in agriculture, annual crops, for example, they don't have that. So you will, you know, you burn the rainforest partly to release some of the nutrients into the soil, but much of that gets washed away. But the rest of it really will only last for a few years. And it's the fact that the land is cheap, which is why it's the area that is mostly used, and the fact that rainforest has no value when it's standing. That's the problem. It only has value as timber or as agricultural land or other things, whereas it really needs to have value for the biodiversity that it harbors and the ecosystem service that it provides. Those are some of the solutions that people are working on, you know, to make it, if you like, less of an issue, or less easy to just say, well, it has no value, let's cut it down, by showing the value that it actually does have, and that we will only see the value of when we've lost those services, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I think that really ties in neatly to what us kind of starting to talk about the value of the rainforest before. And so let's kind of move on to what are the solutions. And I was meant to say to everybody, if you have any questions, I am obviously chipping in quite a few to Mark. I find this topic so interesting. But if you do have any questions, please just write them in the comments on the side, and I will ask Mark kind of once he's responded to this question. So what are how are we addressing some of these threats to the rainforest?
So I think there's really sort of three things that we're doing. One is the definition of protected areas. And since the first protected area was established in 1870, they have grown in number and in extent, and now cover around 17% of the global land area, and even more in rainforest areas. I mean, the thing with rainforest areas is it's relatively easy to define a protected area because, again, you know, in many cases there is no other value for the land. So, you know, countries like Brazil have very high coverage of protected areas. However, not all protected areas are properly protected on the ground. We call those paper parks because they're protected on paper in law, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything on the ground. So protected areas have been successful where they are properly protected, and they are our best, the best way we have of continuing to have a functioning nature on our side in future. But we do have to keep an eye on them. So yeah, the second solution is monitoring, and in particular satellite monitoring. And the slide behind me shows how geographers turn satellite data into information on deforestation to monitor where protected areas are being deforested and where not. So nowadays we have lots of satellites looking down at Earth, measuring all sorts of things, taking all sorts of imagery, and with some computer science and a lot of geography, we can understand the changes in those images to identify deforestation. And there are a number of deforestation monitoring systems out there. This is one called Terra-I, and what you see is a sort of the green outline of a shaded protected area. This is somewhere in the Western Amazon. And then the orange colors are areas that have been recently deforested. And this data provides information every 16 days across the tropics of areas being deforested. Now, most of that deforestation is outside the protected area, so there's nothing that can be done. But you see there's also deforestation inside the protected area, and by definition that's illegal. And so, you know, that then feeds into law enforcement, because most protected areas in rainforests are in very remote areas, and they're outside the law. They're very far from the law. Whereas, satellite systems enable us to, on the one hand, identify illegal deforestation like that in a protected area. Secondly, to understand what's driving deforestation. Is it being converted to pastures for cattle? Is it being converted to cropland? What is the commodity? What is the crop that is driving this deforestation? And then thirdly, it helps us to manage the consequences by thinking about how some of those ecosystem services, like the hazard mitigation services, might be being lost, and what protection we might need to put downstream so that we avoid flooding or other things. So protected areas, I think, are the first mechanism that we're helping to manage these threats, monitoring largely through satellite remote sensing, but also on the ground technology and airborne technology sometimes as well is the second. And then the third are various sort of policy mechanisms whose main aim is to give value to standing forests, to recognize the value of what forests provide, so that there is then a trade-off between that value, which we're already getting, and the value of low quality agriculture, right? And those policy mechanisms include a sort of United Nations scheme called REDD, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, in which countries are paid to protect forests that would otherwise be at risk of deforestation. So particularly low-income countries can benefit from this. They often have much of the remaining rainforest, and it needs to be of value to them, and this is one way that it can be. The other is schemes where users of ecosystem services, so for example, water users, agricultural or hydropower water users downstream of a rainforest, pay for the protection of that rainforest because it's providing them with these services. And then just recently we had the Convention on Biological Diversity COP, Conference of the Parties. It came after the Climate Conference of the Parties, and our current target for global protected areas, which we actually met, was 17% by 2020, and we got there, 17% globally, more or less. The new target negotiated at the UN Convention on Biodiversity is that by 2030, we go to 30%, both on land and at sea. That is much more significant target. And this is not to say that a protected area is a fenced off area where you can't do anything. It's an area where you sustainably use the land, and in particular, the people who already live there sustainably use the land. And this is a key mechanism by which we hope to maintain rainforests into the future. And then, of course, as a last resort, because we have to have a last resort, there are various ARCs, ARCs, that we are using, such as zoos, such as the various gene and seed banks that are maintained around the world, so that the species that we are finding, at least we can help secure those that are at risk by having their genes or their seeds, or indeed having them alive in a zoo. That is, of course, not the best answer. The other three mechanisms will hopefully get us where we need to be, but that's our insurance mechanism.
Earlier you spoke about the kind of, if we could recognise the value of tropical rainforests, then that would hopefully reduce the value of tropical rainforests for the diversity, then biodiversity. Then if we don't see them as valuable in terms of, say, just cheap space, then that would hopefully stop deforestation, for example. What is the biggest barrier to that? Because obviously you've mentioned how some countries might be paid to protect some of the rainforests. Do you think there will be a shift in mindset? And what's the barrier to achieving that?
I think the biggest barrier is economics. Economics is the dismal science, in the sense that it treats the world in a very simplistic way. Uh, that, for example, trees only have value through the commodities that can be supplied from them, the timber, and deforestation to produce timber. When you sell that timber, you offset the cost of producing the timber. You don't offset all the negative implications of having cut down that tree, including the impact on people downstream, etc., because of increased flooding or whatever it is. So, the way that economics works is that it pays to be environmentally damaging because you don't have to pay in the price of the product. And I think that's the greatest barrier. And there's been a lot of work since, well, in the last 25 years to try and do a better economics that better recognizes these externalities, we call them, the bad things that you pass on to other people and are not costed in the price of a product. And if you were able to do that, then damaging the environment to produce commodities becomes more expensive, and doing it in a better, more sustainable way, either in a different place or in the same place but managed differently, that could become cheaper, right? And then the incentives are there, whereas at the moment all the economic incentives are to do things unsustainably.
I've just said if anybody does have any questions, we've still got kind of one kind of question to Mark in terms of how he got to where he was. So there is still time, but please do write them in the comments if you do have questions. I'm assuming because you obviously spent a lot of your time and career dedicated to understanding about deforestation and teaching it to students at university as well. I wondered whether you are hopeful about the future of deforestation.
I think I am, in the sense that in the 30 years that I have been studying rainforests, during that period, lots of rainforests have been destroyed, but our understanding of the rates of deforestation has increased, enormously. So, the deforestation that was occurring 30 years ago, we hardly knew anything about it. Right now, we know, within 16 days, where it's occurring, when it's occurring, why it's occurring. And I think the next step is just to action that, and that's starting. These targets of 30% sustainable use areas by 2030 are pretty significant. And I think they will happen because I think in the end, most people recognize that a future without intact nature, whether you're talking about rainforests or whether you're talking about the places around you at home here in the UK, is not an acceptable future. You need the right balance of nature and agriculture in your landscapes to provide both the food that we need and the other materials that we need, but also the ecosystem services that we also need. So I'm pretty positive on that, because I think on the one hand we have no choice, and secondly the rate of progress has been increasing very rapidly.
Brilliant. And so shall we get on to kind of one question we've been asking all guests is how do they get to where they are? And then do you have any advice for students taking their next steps?
Sure. Okay. Well, I kind of bumbled into where I am, really. I've always been interested in the environment, in nature and conservation, even as a child. That led me, I think, to do an A-levels in geography, biology, and computer science. Geography and biology because that was my interest in the environment and nature, and computer science, which was not an easy topic to do then because there weren't many A-levels in computer science. And computer science because I'm really interested in technical skills as well. And as you've seen, a lot of the work I do on rainforests is involves computing as well, and remote sensing and so on. Geographers do a lot of that these days. So I did an A-level, and then having completed that, I went to Bristol to do a BSc in geography. Really enjoyed that, and so went straight into a PhD at King's College London, where I still am. Nowadays, you would usually do a master's in between a BSc and a PhD, and my PhD was on the impacts of climate change. This was in the early 1990s. We're still talking about climate change now. And I've been teaching and researching ever since, really. And, you know, started working on rainforests as soon as I finished my PhD. In terms of advice for other students, I'd probably say three things. One, you know, get skilled up. It's easy to think that all you need is your sort of academic training, but practical skills such as computing, you know, leadership training, language training, electronics are really important, not just alongside your academic program to your academic program, but also in the rest of your life. Follow your passion, even though school and uni can be very difficult. If you have a long-term goal that is your passion, then you will get through the difficult periods to get to that goal. And thirdly, take advice. Everyone who is there to support you, your teachers, your parents, others, they've gone through what you have gone through in your education, and their advice and mentorship can be really helpful, not least in avoiding the mistakes, because they've probably already made all those mistakes, and by avoiding them, they can very quickly help you get where you want to be. So that would be my two penneth, as they say. So that.
Thank you so much. Sorry everyone, I've just had a bit of a coughing fit. So that does bring us to the end. Thank you, Mark, so much for taking the time to speak to us and all the interesting parts. See the tears coming through right now. Just wanted to say a huge thank you to you and all the information you've given us. And if everyone can check online, there will be this video up on Time for Geography and shortened videos as well. So going to leave you there, but have a lovely rest of your evening, everyone.